Welcome you to this midweek service. It's always good to be with you in the middle of the week and to come together and get our eyes, ears, and attention and hearts focused on the things of the Lord for a little while. So we're glad that you're here. Take your sheet tonight and just a couple of quick things, and then we'll get right into our study. We did go ahead and postpone the art trip. Didn't want to do that, but we just did not have the response we thought we'd have. So we're going to back up and look at that again, maybe in the spring, and see what happens with that. But if you had signed up and paid a deposit, you'll make sure that you get that back. You're not going to lose anything. So anyway, so we'll see what happens, and we will look at it a little bit later. Soccer registration, you see that here. They'll have evaluations a week from Saturday. So get the word out. Help us get the word out to families. People may have kids that would like to play. The website's on there, and if you'd like to help in some way with soccer, please make sure and let them know. The Ground 40 meal, next one is Friday week, and I think the sheets are out there. They were out there. They're already filled up and taken down. Okay, all right, that's good. So anyway, that's Friday week. We still have a few spots for the Discovery class. If you would like to participate in that and have not, please let Pastor Gary know. That'll start the Sunday after Labor Day, which will be September the 10th. So please remember that. And then on the 17th of September at 4 o'clock, we're going to have our Sunday afternoon Sunday school. And the purpose of this for our classes is to plan and pray together and organize, talk about the year. Just look at what the goals for the class are, that kind of thing. And our youth and children will have activities as well. So 4 o'clock on that Sunday afternoon. So I hope that you plan to come and just it's sort of like a kickoff to our new Sunday school year. So I hope that you'll plan to come and be a part of that special day. And so, Pastor Gary, there will be some instructions. I know that is there anything that we need to add to that? So there'll be some instructions, and you'll be getting some guidelines about sort of what to do in your class. And so anyway, I hope that you will plan to participate in that if you possibly can. Well, we're looking at the Master's Men, and tonight we're going to look at a gentleman named Philip. So I want you to take your Bible, just go ahead and turn to John's Gospel and just leave it there for a moment. I'll give you some specific passages in a moment, but we're going to be almost exclusively in John's Gospel tonight as we look at Philip, the disciple named Philip. Now, as I've been doing sort of in up to now, let me just ask this question. What do we already know, or what can you tell me if you know anything about Philip? What do we already know before we even start tonight? What have you know, or what have you heard or read about the disciple named Philip? That much, huh? Wrong Philip. That's the wrong Philip. That's the wrong Philip. That's Philip the evangelist. Anybody? We know about Philip. All right, so Philip is listed in every list of the disciples. He is listed in the 5th position in every list. Now remember, there was an inner circle of 4. Do you remember who they were? Who's the first 4? Andrew, Peter, James, and John. Okay, they're listed. In every list, though, after those 4 comes the name of Philip, which might indicate that Philip was the leader of the second group of 4. We don't know that for sure, but just some things about Philip. Philip is not to be confused with Philip the evangelist. Now remember Philip the evangelist. Remember the early church in Acts 6 appointed 7 men, okay? And those 7 men took care of the situation in the church. The church grew. Then after the death of Stephen, Philip was preaching a revival. Now, that's Philip the evangelist. He was preaching a revival in Samaria, and the Lord told him to leave that revival and go to the desert. Now, how would you like that? You're in a booming revival, and God says, look, leave this and go down to the desert. I got one guy I want you to talk to. Philip did it, though, and he reached that Ethiopian with the gospel. And what did the Ethiopian do? He took that and took the gospel to his own country. So you see, that is not the same Philip that we're talking about. That's Philip the evangelist. This is Philip the apostle. Philip was from the town of Bethsaida, the same place that Peter and Andrew were from. So it's likely that they knew each other. They might have gone to the same synagogue together. But he is from the town of Bethsaida. The name Philip, and I really don't, I found no answer for why this is. The name Philip is a Greek name. It's not a Jewish name, it's a Greek name. Do you know what it means? It means lover of horses. And I did all kinds of trying to find out why. I don't know. I never did get a clear answer. There was a few little things about it. Lover of horses. But it is important that you understand it was a Greek name. All the 12 disciples also had Jewish names. But it's interesting that in the scriptures, when we see Philip, his Greek name is the one that is referred to instead of his Jewish name. Now, can you think of a reason or two why his Greek name might have been used instead of his Jewish name? Any ideas? Absolutely. There was an influx into that area. The Greek language was penetrating in the area. A large group of Greeks were moving in. And so that's probably one of the reasons that his name is used. It could be that Philip's own family were Hellenistic Jews. A Hellenistic Jew was simply a Jew that spoke Greek. All right? And it could be that he and his family were Hellenistic Jews. And it could be that they used his Greek name to help them identify with the number of Greeks that were coming into the area. What do you think Philip did for a living? Take a wild guess. Most likely a fisherman. We are not told specifically that he was a fisherman. However, if you'll remember in John 21, after the resurrection, Peter, of course, had denied the Lord and all of that, and Peter made a decision after that. And what did Peter decide to do? He said, I'm going back fishing. See, and when he said that, this is in John chapter 21, a group of disciples said, we're going to go with you. We're going with you. Now, Philip is not named in that passage, but it mentions two other disciples, and the other guys that are named hung around with Philip a lot. So it is very, very possible, even likely, that Philip was a fisherman. At least he had some experience as a fisherman. He was in that group. The only gospel that refers specifically to Philip in terms of an individual situation is the Gospel of John. There's nothing individually mentioned about Philip in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Interesting. As far as his personality is concerned, if you think about the people that we've studied already, their personalities, what kind of personality did Peter have? Impulsive, outspoken. How about John? In the beginning especially. He was forceful. He was impetuous. So was James. Same deal. Andrew was not as forceful, and yet he had some quiet leadership ability. Philip's personality is different than any other disciple we've studied so far. Philip was, John MacArthur calls him a bean counter. He calls him the bean counter. Now, what do you think he means by that? All right, so he's looking to count the stuff. He's counting to weigh the evidence. He wants proof. He's a facts and figures guy. Prove it to me. He's an analytical guy. Do y'all have anybody that you know that loves to analyze stuff to death? Now, don't look at each other. You know, analyze. You've got the paralysis of analysis. I mean, just analyze everything. If it doesn't add up and you can't add it up and all the figures work out, if you can't dot every I, cross every T, they don't want anything to do with it. This has got to either make total, complete sense to me after I've analyzed it, or I don't want anything to do with it. That is the kind of guy that Philip was. Philip was one of those people who was more inclined to identify reasons something couldn't be done than he was to find a way to get it done. That's who he was, and we're going to see that in his profile tonight. So, let's begin tonight by looking at his calling, and then we're going to look at his character. So let's start with his calling, and I want you to turn to John 1. We have seen part of this passage already, but we're going to go back to it tonight, look at a different section of it. John chapter 1. So turn there and we'll find Philip's calling. And it is a little bit unique from the others that we've studied so far. John chapter 1, and we will pick up in verse 43. Now, what we're about to read occurred the day after Jesus had called Andrew, John, and Peter. Remember, Andrew, John, and Peter, who were they following before they met Christ? John the Baptist. And remember, after they realized he was the Messiah, they began to follow Jesus, Andrew, John, Peter. Well, this event that we're about to read occurs the day after that, starting in verse 43. So let's take a look. Verse 43 of John 1. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." Now, we'll talk more about Nathanael a little bit later, but let's focus on Philip. Can you, if you'll read verse 43 again, and the way this happened, can you pick out a difference immediately between the way Philip was called and the way Andrew, for example, Andrew and Peter and John began to follow Jesus? Can you see any differences there? It says in verse 43, did Philip find Jesus or did Jesus find Philip? Well, so if you remember, it was Andrew and John who earlier in chapter 1 approached Jesus and began to ask him questions. Where are you staying? All this kind of stuff. And you could basically say they basically sort of found him, found Christ. Here, we're told that Jesus found Philip. It says he was about to go back into Galilee, but he found Philip, and Jesus called to him and said, "Follow me." So that's a little bit different. This is the first time we read that Jesus physically sought out and found one of them. Now I want to just stop there for a moment, and I think you already know this. We know that spiritually speaking, from a biblical perspective, God finds us, we don't find him. We know that remember, Jesus said the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So in one perspective, I hear people say, I found Jesus. No, Jesus found you. Now, you might have been looking for him, but he found you. You see how that works? It's really both. It's really both. So understanding that from a theological perspective, here it is interesting, though, that Jesus actually made an effort, went and said to Philip, "You follow me." So, what do we find out about Philip in his call? Number one, Philip had a seeking heart. He had a seeking heart. I want you to notice verse 45 and tell me whether or not you think Philip, when Jesus told him to follow him, was ready to do it. So look at verse 45 here in this passage. As he's talking to Nathanael, Philip says, "We have found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Now, what does that tell you about what Philip had been doing? What had Philip been doing? All right, he'd been studying, right? He'd been studying. He'd been looking, all of that. And so he was already prepared. His heart was prepared. His mind was prepared. So he was ready to answer when Jesus said, "Follow me." Philip didn't have to hesitate a whole lot because he'd already been searching. He had a seeking heart. He wasn't going to just sit back and wait to see what happened. He wanted to know. He was seeking who the Messiah really was. Now, the other thing we find out about him is he had not only a seeking heart, he had a seeker's heart. Now, how do we know that? How do we know he had a seeker's heart? Because the first thing he did after Jesus says, "Follow me," the first thing he does is what? He finds his friend Nathanael. And he says, "We have found him." Very similar to what Andrew did with Peter, found his brother. So the first thing Philip does is go to find his friend Nathanael and tell him about the Messiah. So here's the question. Do you think, in terms of evangelism, sharing your faith in Christ, do you think it is true that one of the best places to start is with your friends that you already have? Can friendships be a fertile field to share your faith in Christ? Okay, why is that? Now, I'm not saying we can't win people we don't know to Jesus. I'm just saying, what difference does it make if you're sharing your faith with a friend that you already have? And why is it easy to talk to them? You already have the connection with them. There's already a relationship there. There's always something in place. A relationship of trust. If they're true friends, there's a relationship of trust. There's a relationship of openness where you can share with them. And that is not to discourage us from sharing Jesus with people we come across. But people often say, I don't know anybody I can talk to about Jesus. Do you have any friends? Do you have anybody that you already have a common bond with? Do you have anybody that you already have the freedom even if they don't come to Christ, they will at least be willing to listen to your testimony or open to talking about spiritual things. So that can be a great, great advantage. So that's Philip's calling. So now let's look at his character. And as we look at Philip's character, we're going to discover his character in 3 incidents that are all found in John's gospel. So the first one we find in John chapter 6. So turn over to John chapter 6. And this is the first incident that tells us something about Philip's character. John chapter 6. You'll recognize this immediately. John chapter 6. We are told that a great multitude was following Jesus. He went up on the mountain, and he was sitting there, a great multitude. We're told at least 5,000 men. Now, do you think was all the people that were there? If it was 5,000 men, it wasn't just 5,000 people. There's probably 15 or 20,000 people. And they'd all gathered around, right? It got late in the day. So look in John 6 and verse 3. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him. He said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these people may eat?" Now, there are all kind of ways we can go with that. First of all, why did he even ask the question? Why did Jesus even ask the question? Okay. But why Philip? Why didn't he say, hey, James, or John, or Nathaniel, or Matthew? Why Philip? Remember what we said about his personality. He asked the facts and the figures guy, right? He asked the analytical one. And so Jesus singled Philip out and asked him where they could buy food. Apparently, it makes sense to me. You do know that the disciples had a treasurer. You know who the treasurer for the disciples was? Unfortunately, yes. He was a thief. We're told he was a thief in John 12. So if the group had a treasurer, it would make sense to me that they had an accountant too, or an administrator, or an arranger. Does it make sense to you if they're traveling around a pretty good group of people, somebody need to be in charge of arrangements? Where are our meals going to come from? Where are we going to stay? All that kind of stuff. You got to have somebody with a calculator for a mind that can figure all that stuff out. Well, that was probably Philip. Jesus knew that. Everybody else knew that. So he asked Philip that particular question. And verse 6 it says, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. By the way, Jesus wasn't asking for an idea or a plan. Jesus didn't run out of ideas and say, oh no, Philip, what are we going to do? Jesus already knew what he was going to do. So what's the point? What do you think? Let me ask you this way. They're sitting on the mountainside, and here comes this multitude of people. Now, I don't know what the other men were doing, other disciples were doing. What do you think Philip was doing at that? The first thing he laid eyes on him, what do you think he's doing? Uh-oh, there's a lot of people coming. He's calculating. He's trying to figure it out. And the reason I know that is because he answers Jesus' question pretty quick here in just a minute. He's already figuring out in his head how many people, at least estimating how many people are coming. Because that's what he did. That was his mindset. I'm going to figure out how many people are coming. He's already calculating it up, already figuring it up. So, Jesus asked him this question. He wasn't asking him to find out what Philip was thinking. Jesus already knew what he was thinking. Remember this. Jesus knew what was in people's hearts. When he dealt with the scribes and the Pharisees, and that's what burned them up, he was able to call them on stuff, and they hadn't said a word because he knew what they were thinking. He knows what we're thinking. Did you know that? Well, you do now. He knows what we're thinking. He knows our thoughts. Jesus already knew. If Jesus already knew what Philip's answer was going to be, why did he ask him? See, again, we're learning about Philip, what we learned with these other guys, and we're going to learn about the ones, they were a work in progress. Would that be a fair statement? These men were a work in progress. They didn't all of a sudden, overnight, they were spiritual giants. They dealt with some of the same stuff we do. They struggle with the same issues we do. There are people today that have a hard time really trusting and following God because they're bean counters. Everything's got to make sense. Everything's got to add up. And if it doesn't add up, I'm not going to do it. And you know that's true. Now they have to jump over a hurdle to really exercise faith. Now remember this. When you were let me put it to you this way. When you were in school and your teacher taught you a bunch of material, after he or she taught you the material, you'd have a little fun activity called a what? A test. To see whether you grasped it or not. So in other words, would it be fair to say your teacher taught you and then they tested you? Got it? By the way, I used to love pop quizzes when I taught school. You know, class would come in and I'd say to them, well, today we're going to have an examination about your parentage, your father in particular. What does that mean? Somebody in the back. It means a pop test, stupid. Anyway, that had nothing to do with nothing. Jesus worked just the other way around. Instead of teaching and then testing, he tested and then taught. Here's what Jesus was up to. He was going to put Philip to the test so that he could show Philip who he really was. He asked Philip this question so that when Philip answered it would reveal not to Jesus. Jesus already knew. It would show Philip where he was and reveal to Philip his own mentality. He tests us not so that he can know more about us, but so we can learn something about ourselves. Y'all see where I'm going with that? Okay, so he tests Philip, and instead of seeing the opportunity for the Lord to teach all these people, Philip had his mind on other stuff. So look at verse 7. What are we going to do, Philip? Philip answered him, 200 denarii, 2/3 of a man's yearly salary worth of bread, is not sufficient for them that every one of them may have a little. So Philip did a quick calculation, said, no way, impossible. It never entered his mind. No, what was wrong with that? I mean, where was he missing it here? He forgot who he was following, who he was walking with. Had Philip already seen some impossible things up to this point? Huh? Philip was there in Cana of Galilee when Jesus turned the water into wine. I mean, he was so occupied with his figures and his facts and his analysis that he forgot the power of Christ. He missed it. Now, we never do that, do we? Got quiet in here, didn't it? Yeah, we do. We find ourselves in situations, and the first thing we do looks impossible. Let me see if I can figure this out. Let me get my calculator, get my pen and my paper, let me get my computer and see if it rings up true. Rather than saying, you know what? I don't know, but I know God knows. And I don't know how this is going to work, but I know God can make it work. You see? Philip had to see that about himself. He had to see where his mentality was headed. And that's why Jesus asked him that question and tested him. Because if you can become, now please don't hear me saying that we don't need to plan or organize or, no. But folks, if we don't leave a room for faith and trust in our walk, we're never going to grow as a Christian. If everything we do, every decision we make, every step we take is based only on what we can see, only what we can feel, only what we can count, we'll never really go where God wants us to go. Okay? The reason a lot of churches are dying on the vine is they have lost the ability to believe in the God of the impossible. And every decision they make is based on facts and figures instead of faith and trust. And the same thing's true in Christian lives too. By the way, I believe in the Old Testament there was a story about a group of people that made their decision not to enter the promised land because they did a calculation and figured they couldn't do it. I don't think God was too pleased with them, was he? Yeah, they all died in the wilderness, didn't they? Because they looked and said, ooh, we don't like the way that looks. Doesn't add up to us. So Philip had to learn that. So Jesus tested his faith and he responded with unbelief. What he's basically saying is impossible, Lord. He's telling Jesus, it's impossible. Well, let me ask you this question. If Philip's faith had been what it ought to be, let's assume his faith had been strong, and Jesus asked him that same question, how would Philip's answer have been different? What would Philip have said? Where are we going to buy food for these people, Philip, that all of them can eat? What would his response been if his faith was healthy? She said, you know, Lord. Come on, what would he have said? Yeah? How about something like this? Lord, if you want to feed them, I know you can do it. So I'm going to sit here and watch how you do it. Lord, I don't know, but you know. And my trust is in you, so I'm going to watch you do it. But you see, he was so caught up with his facts and figures, there was no room in his thinking for faith in Jesus' supernatural power. And we can get into the same coincidence. By the way, did Jesus have a plan? Sure did. We know how the rest of the story plays out. Little boy shows up. By the way, who brought the little boy? Andrew brings the little boy. How much did he have? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Was that enough? And remember, Philip had already said, if you had 2/3 of a year's salary, each person would only get a little bit. How much did those people end up eating that day? All they wanted, and 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Why 12? One for each disciple. Take this home, boys. And now, and I would like to say, wow, that got their attention. But you know what? If you go a couple of chapters over, they're arguing again about some of the same stuff. They were hard, thick-headed. They were a work in progress. We are a work in progress because we'll have a faith victory and God will prove something to us and wow. And next time we find ourselves in a situation, first thing here, where's my calculator? Where's my slide rule? Where's my analysis now to see if this is possible or not? And that's just God. And see, here's the thing. God knows that, and He loves us anyway, but that's who we are. All right, that's the first place where we see His character. Now, let's look at the second story. It's in John 12. The second glimpse into His character, and it's in John 12. And we looked at this one when we were studying Andrew. So let's go back to John 12 and verse 20, and let's read verses 20 through 22 here. John 12 and verse 20. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast, and they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and they asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus. Now, we talked about this story earlier in the context of Andrew just bringing people to Christ. But let's look at it now from Philip's perspective. These Greeks come with a request of Philip, and what was that request to Philip? We want to see Jesus. Why did they come to Philip first? There's the Greek name. What'd you say? So check his calendar. You mean to see if he had time on his calendar to do that? Yeah, maybe, check it. Let me see here if I can squeeze that in. Perhaps he was great. Perhaps the people, they were aware that Philip was sort of the administrator, the arranger for the group, and they said, well, if we want to see Jesus, this would be the guy to talk to. Now, was this a difficult request for Philip to honor? No. Is this something that Philip could have done? Easily. Could he have simply said, sure, let's go, I'll take you right to him? So why didn't he? Think about his mentality. What he tend to focus on, and tell me why he didn't take him straight to Jesus himself. That's a great word there. Maybe he figured Jesus is busy. That's certainly a possibility. All right. So you're thinking that he thought, okay, because he felt like Andrew would be a better, okay, that's certainly possible too. Okay, but going back to Philip, what would have hindered Philip from just doing it himself? I hear what you're saying about Andrew, but what would have hindered Philip from just doing it himself? Let me tell you what I believe. Jesus had made statements earlier, and Philip had heard those statements about Jesus. Jesus made statements similar to this. I go first to the sheep of the house of Israel. That's what Philip heard. Jesus had said, I go first. Now that didn't mean that Greeks Jesus didn't want to see them. But what Philip heard was a rule. He heard a rule, and the rule is, you don't bring Greeks to Jesus. If I bring Greeks to Jesus and I'm not supposed to, I'll get in trouble. You know why? Because he's analyzing that thing. I'm analyzing this thing, and I'm not going to have it said that I broke a rule, so I'm going to let Andrew do it. Now, what happened when he did that was he missed an opportunity. He missed an opportunity. And he decided to play it safe and okay, let Andrew do it, thinking that Jesus would not receive these Greek seekers, all because of what he had heard. Rather than investigating or whatever, that's the path he took. Sometimes we get procedures, rules, assumptions, and we let those things, we focus so hard on those things without it really investigating, we end up missing an opportunity to make a difference in somebody's life. So reading on below there, Andrew brings the Greeks to Jesus. What does Jesus do with them? He just begins to talk to them. And you know what he does? He shares the gospel with them. So picking up in John 12, look at verse 23. Jesus speaking to Andrew and Philip, but also to the Greeks who were there. The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it produces much fruit. He's talking about his upcoming death, ladies and gentlemen. He's talking about dying so that life can be the result. Verse 25, he who loves his life will lose it. He who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternity. If anyone serves me, let him follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. So basically, does Jesus turn these Greeks away? Is there any evidence that Jesus said, no, wait a minute, no, I'm here for the house of Israel, you guys come back later? Is there any evidence that Jesus did that? No, Jesus spoke to them. Jesus talked to them about his ministry. And the assumption that he would not is what got Philip in trouble. So we come back to that mindset of putting faith on the back burner and focusing on our own assumptions and thoughts and calculations. Now, there's one third picture, and to me, this is the most stunning of all, and it's found in John 14. So turn over to John 14, and there's one more picture here of Philip. And this one takes place in the upper room the night Jesus was arrested. John chapter 14. And this is, if not the most well-known and most read passage in John's gospel, it's one of them. John 14, verse 1, you know what Jesus is, he's just sharing with these men. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. By the way, these men are heartbroken. Why are they heartbroken at this point? Why are they troubled? Why does he have to tell them, let not your heart be troubled? What are they troubled about? He said, yeah, they know he's been hinting it. I'm not going to be around now. Their hearts are troubled. They've invested everything to follow him, and now, you see, they still hadn't grasped it yet. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. Now, where was Jesus talking about going there? Heaven. He says, you know where I'm going, and you know the way to get there. What is the way to get to heaven? Jesus said, he is. But listen to Thomas in verse 5. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? We'll get to Thomas later. There we go again. And then here comes verse 6. Jesus said to him, Thomas says, how can we know the way? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That is a bedrock. That is a bedrock right there of the plan of salvation. Verse 7, he continues, if you had known me, you would have known my Father. Also, and from now on, you know him and you have seen him. Here comes Philip. Now, by this time, this is after almost 2 years of following Jesus. Would it make sense that they should have been a little more clear on what he was talking about? You would think so, wouldn't you? And Jesus was saying here, the only way to heaven was faith in him. And then he says in verse 7, if you've known me, you've known the Father, and you will know him and you have seen him. What is he, when Jesus makes that statement in verse 7, what was Jesus saying about himself? I am God. Me and the Father are one. You've already seen God. You've been seeing God. I am him. My essence and the essence of my Father are just like that. Verse 8. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it's sufficient for us. What is Philip saying? Uh-huh. Yeah, he did not get it. And you're right, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. So, I don't know. I just say stuff. Some of you are like, well, where'd that come from? Beats me. You brought it up. You mentioned the Sadducees. Look, after all Philip had heard and seen, now he's going to say, show us the Father and I'll believe it. If you'll just show us the Father, Jesus, if you just show him to us, we'll be glad to. What did he think Jesus had been doing for the last 2 years? Yeah, unless you can see it. We'll talk more about this when we get to Thomas. Thomas did not believe until he saw the marks. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Thomas, because you've seen and believed. But Jesus went on and said, but blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. They didn't know about it. I mean, Jesus talked to the disciples about the Holy Spirit, but generally speaking, the Jews didn't have any concept of that. And they did not until Pentecost. The disciples had an idea, and they were told to go. Jesus taught them about the Comforter, taught them about the Spirit. But then, if you remember, after Jesus, he said, after I ascend, I want you to go first to Jerusalem and stay there until the Spirit comes on you, and stay there. And I think then. But it's amazing how Jesus had to be thinking, what are you talking about, Philip? Again, he's trying to analyze. It doesn't make sense that you can be human and be God at the same time. That you can be, that your essence is not, you're the God-man. You're 100% man, but also 100% God. And look how Jesus responds, starting in verse 9. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you've not known me, Philip? I wonder if everyone wants to ask us that question. Have you been following me for so long and you still don't get it? About whatever it is in our life. He who has seen me has seen the Father, so how can you say, show us the Father? You've already seen the Father, Philip. Open your eyes, your spiritual eyes. Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. So, for almost 3 years, Philip had been looking into the face of God. He'd been hearing the words of God. He'd been looking at the works of God. And it still wasn't clear to him. And it all ties back into the barrier to his faith that analytical mindset was. Now, I know that we go through these things and we want to, you say, well, boy, he should have known better. And, and we can certainly say that. But can we just get honest for a minute and acknowledge that there are times when we go through things and we react the same way with a lack of faith, a lack of trust. And, and I got to wonder sometimes if God must look at me and say, Billy, after all this time, you don't know any better than that. You see, we all struggle with stuff like that. We're all works in progress. We're all on a journey. So the fact of the matter is, yes, he allowed his preoccupation with mundane things. There's some people that can see the big picture. Okay, they're able to see the whole thing. But there are other people, all they can see is the trees. They just focus on the trees, focus on the mundane things, and they can't get their eyes up. Philip was one of those mundane people. He never could, he had a hard time grasping the big picture. Now, here's the good news. He finally got it. He finally got it. And if you read through a lot of the historical pieces from the early church, We know that Philip was instrumental in the life of the early church. We know he was a leader in the church. We know that many people came to Christ through his preaching. We also know that Philip was martyred 8 years after James died. Philip was martyred by stoning. He was stoned to death. So at some point it clicked. It clicked. And he fully understood. Now, we've seen this with all the other four. Now we've seen it with Philip. True or false? If our faith is flawed or we're weak in some way, we don't understand, we're ignorant, stubborn, God just won't use us. God can't use us. True or false? When we are stubborn, have lack of faith, whatever, what does God do? Does he throw us on the shelf and say, I'll go get somebody else? What does he do? What did he do with these men? He kept teaching them. He kept leading them. He kept putting them out there. And they began to be molded into the people, the men that God needed them to be in the early church. And that ought to give us hope. Now, Philip, the key to all of that is this. At some point, Philip had to make a decision. I need to open my heart and start learning what faith means instead of analyzing everything. Because if he hadn't, he would have never made any progress. So, while God knows that we lean toward all that, what he's looking for is for us to come to the point where we say, listen, Lord, I want to learn to live by faith. I want to learn to know how powerful you are, and that nothing is impossible with you. Now, if we don't get to that point and have that desire, we'll get stuck right where we are and never make any progress. But I believe if we have the attitude that says, Lord, I want to live by faith. I want to trust you. I know that nothing's impossible with you. Then I believe God will move heaven and earth to teach us that and to help us to grow. As we mentioned at the beginning of this study, these master's men were not perfect. In fact, they were far, far, far from it. But God took them and did some great things in their life. And that ought to encourage us. It ought to encourage us. All right? Okay, let's bow our heads. Father, thank you so much for allowing us to take your word again tonight and to learn not only about these men who you did such amazing things with, even though they were flawed in so many ways. But Father, thank you for teaching us, because we all have different personalities and we all have different bents. We have strengths, we have weaknesses. But Lord, if we'll place those in your hands, you can turn our weaknesses into strengths. And God, you can overcome all the other stuff and use us just like you used Philip and like you used the others. God, I pray tonight that when we get in a situation that looks impossible, God, I pray before we ever conclude, Lord, may we never come to the conclusion that that's impossible, because we serve a God who specializes in the impossible. So, Lord, don't ever, ever let us count you out. Whether it's as an individual or as a church, don't ever let us count you out, because you are all powerful and you specialize in the miraculous. Father, thank you for these folks who are here tonight. So grateful for them. Pray you'll bless them in a special way. Bless the remainder of our time together. We give you honor and praise and glory in Jesus' name. Amen.